You're actually thinking maybe a cut is more likely on the cards rather than a hike.
Yeah, look, so I think there's space for a hike, but it's purely political, first of all, right? So any hike is unwarranted by the data. In fact, I'm going to come back on this show in probably 6 months' time and talk to you about the Fed and why they've cut rates, right? Because I think ultimately we've already got an earnings recession in that economy. The jobs recession is beginning. We've got very late cycle kind of lack of productivity, unit labor cost pressures. The corporate sector always responds the same way, by cutting costs. Right? And the biggest cost they can cut right now is labor. So I think that process has begun. But I think, between now and then, so perhaps the July meeting, September seems too far away, there may be pressure on Yellen to do something, but that's more to do with the election. Right?
So pressure from politics, you think?
I think there's going to be an awful lot of pressure put on Mrs. Yellen in the run-up to the election by Mr. Trump. If you know anything about Mrs. Yellen and her husband, who they worked for in the past, their political leanings, which are well known, Trump is going to attack. And I think if you're Trump, and this is kind of the same issue with Brexit, right? The issue is going to be, hey, these rich guys have done very well out of all of this QE and all this other stuff. The average Joe has done very badly out of this, and that pressure is going to be on Yellen. So I think there's just my view. I think there's perhaps some political motivation to do one more hike, just to kind of show to Mr. Trump that she's not there to backstop Hillary, for example, right?
But and Bob, that, why not store up a little more? Why not store up a little more dry powder? I mean, is one hike up to another 25 basis points in the face of lending costs at an all-time low really going to do anything to slow up the economy?
It's not about slowing the economy. I think the idea of doing one more hike may be to kind of show that the Fed isn't married to to Hillary, or that more specifically that Mrs. Yellen isn't so overtly pro-Hillary or pro-Democrat that she'd do anything, whatever it takes to get her in. I think it's not about the economy. The economy is slowing down anyway. And look, I think from my perspective, as I said earlier, I think we've got the beginnings of some recessionary indicators already flashing. I think that's going to get worse. The U.S. is not an island, right? The global economy is slowing down. If you look at the Fed's own projections, they're revising down growth. I think the biggest problem for the U.S. is that nominal GDP this year is going to come in again probably well below 3%, which for that economy is awful, right? So I think, central banks can kind of play with the markets a little bit, but the reality of the data, the underlying economic strength is globally, in the U.S., in the Eurozone, in the U.K., it's not there. And by the way, this is not just down to Brexit, right? That's a nonsense. Brexit is having some impact on some elements of the economy, but the bigger picture is that globally, we just haven't got enough demand.
What feeling do you get as we're going in? I mean, is it truly neck and neck as we approach the vote, or do you think at the end of the day, the UK will likely remain in the EU?
So look, this is not a house view. My private opinion is my private opinion. I think it's going to be very close. I think I'm relatively confident in that. I think the city, the street, the market has kind of obviously reflected the increasing probabilities of a Brexit over the last few weeks. I think there's already a debate beginning in the market about the fact that if it's very, very close, could we have a second referendum later this year on the basis of a renewed offer of concessions from the EU? That seems way out there at the moment, I get that. But I think this phrase Article 50 is kind of buzzing around the market these days a little bit. I think...
Where hurts in terms of asset classes? I've got a great chart. This is, pound volatility spiking. It's phenomenal. We've got, of course, on a trade-weighted basis, the pound has slumped by about 7% this year. This is in 1 month implied volatility. Just look at the spike. We are currently just highest level since financial crisis back in October 2008, Bob.
Yeah, I think that's the 1 month. I think if you look further out, I think it's a lot calmer. I think that should be expected. I think...
So we're overblowing it?
Well, look, in the short term, anything can happen. We can get lots of vol. I think, that can happen today, right? Who knows, right? But I think on any kind of, you look through a cycle, and I think these days, we've been kind of captured. We've got Stockholm Syndrome. Let's look through the cycle a little bit, right? Not one country in the world wants to have a strong currency, right? If the worst outcome of Brexit, right, is a weaker sterling, that's something that every country in the world, Japan, or the Eurozone, the US, would love to have, right? Do I think the UK economy over time could adjust? Yeah. Do I think that any problems as a result of Brexit would also spill into Europe? Yeah. Beyond that, I don't think we can say an awful lot. Look, I'm old enough to remember people telling me that not just exiting the ERM and not signing up for the euro was going to hasten the end of UK. Right? It was the opposite. Right? Now, I'm not suggesting that this will always be the opposite, but if Brexit is going to be close, if we get Brexit, there's going to be panic and what have you, but in the short term, personally, I think lots of the market will look at that as an opportunity. And honestly, I know that you had a scene from Russia earlier on. All I've heard from foreign investors and foreign wealthy people is that if sterling cheapens up enough, they're going to buy UK assets. So go figure.
Let me just jump in here and say I'm sure that you're hearing from wealthy people. None of them are buying Deutsche Bank shares. Right now, we have Deutsche Bank shares falling to a low 12 euros 96 is what we're seeing, the lowest on record. They've actually fallen at one point to 12.84. So big drop. This is a one-year chart of Deutsche Bank, but we were talking earlier about Paul Achleitner saying it would be a disaster for the UK economy, a political disaster for Europe. Bob, do you think that people are sensationalizing this, or is it truly such a momentous vote?
I think it's a bit of both. I don't think it would be necessary. I think people are sensationalizing, sorry, but I think it is it would be momentous. And I think this is really where we need to step back and view this, and we also look in the context of Mr. Trump, for example, in the US, right? The average citizen actually really doesn't listen to the economic argument the way that we in the market do, right? The average citizen, whether it's in the US, in the Eurozone, in the UK, has kind of sat there for the last 8 years and seen their standards of living, their real incomes fall, whilst the inequality system in the economy has gone through the roof, right? Now, I'm not a socialist, but I think Mr. Piketty had some kind of point, right? And the difference between now and 100 years ago is 100 years ago, most poor people, who were much poorer than they are now, didn't realize how rich people were, and rich people were much richer then, proportionately. These days, it's very transparent, right? So if you're an average citizen, you've kind of sat around seeing your house prices flat, your real income's lower, your standard of living falling, and I think people are responding to that inequality, and it's protest against the system, right? So we can kind of say that people should be more focused on the economic argument. How can you say that when people can say, well, I haven't really benefited from any economic upside in the last 8 years, right? So people kind of are struggling to believe in that, and I think that's what's going on here with Brexit, with Trump, and we'll see it with Front National next year, AFD next year. British people don't hate Europe, right? But it's kind of like, it's a protest against, I think, the establishment. And look, if there's anyone to blame, and again, this is just my personal view, if there's anyone to blame, you could blame Cameron for a speech he made here, promises that haven't been able to be delivered, and you should probably look at the EU and the EC and say, well, the deal that you gave Cameron, frankly, it was going to be almost impossible for David Cameron to say, well, I got a good deal. So I think it's all kind of a knock-on from that.